We are starting. So we're going to talk about meditation a little bit tonight, just some of the basics and the general theme. I will try and give some insights as well as to what is done and what should be done and what perhaps should not be done. In other words, what's not going to lead you towards the goal the desirable goal. Okay, first of all, as everybody knows by now, anyone who's been coming to these classes for some time, there are four primary worlds, four manifested worlds. There's one world which is a transcendent world, a non manifested world. The worlds from bottom to top are called Asiya, is the lowest world, or corresponding to the world of action. The world of Yetzira, which is sometimes called the world of formation. I'll explain why on another occasion. The world of Bria, the world of coming into being, the world of creation, it's often called, but it's coming into being, that's the important thing. And then there's the world of Atzilut, the highest, the in fact the divine world, the world in which godliness is manifested. And then there's a meta world, a transcendent world, which is called the world of Adam Kadmon, a primordial world, which is not in any kind of reality that we would recognize, and therefore it's considered to be a meta world rather than a world in itself. Now, the word world is, as we've explained a number of times, from the word he'elem, the word olam in Hebrew, from the word he'elem, concealment. Because every world is a concealment of godliness. The higher the world, the less the concealment. The lower the world, the more the concealment. But every world, even the world of Atzilut, is in some sense or another a concealment of the divine essence. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to exist. Corresponding to these four worlds are four levels of consciousness, and then there's a fifth transcendent level of consciousness. These four levels of consciousness are called, from the lowest to the highest, are called nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, and ultimately there's a fifth level called yechida. Now, these levels of consciousness, or levels of soul, if you prefer, these levels of consciousness correspond to the four worlds. And therefore, the most basic meditation is that the lowest level of consciousness is meditates primarily on the lowest world. The second level of consciousness is meditation is in the second world, in the world of Yetzirah. And so it goes on all the way up. Now, I want to explain it in more detail. I'm just telling you the broad outlines to start off with. But there is something that is often left out of this simple meditative process, and that is how to transition from one world to the other, what the transition point from one world to the other is. And that is one of the things that I'm going to speak about now. In other words, it's a transition from the lower world to the higher world, from a lower level of consciousness to a higher level of consciousness. So let's put it like this. In Kabbalistic terminology, we have what's called lights and vessels. In other words, we have a certain type of divine energy that becomes visible is not really the right word, but it becomes sort of tangible, visible, experienced. I think experience is the right word. It becomes experienced through what is called a vessel. Obviously, no, it's not a vessel in the usual sense of a pot or a or a petri dish or a I don't know, some kind of container, Tupperware. We don't mean it like that. Obviously, it's just a term which it's a terminology. It's called a kli in Hebrew. It's that which contains, usually that which contains something else. In Kabbalistic terminology, is usually the letters of a word. Words contain sounds. They also contain ideas. They also contain feelings. They contain light. depending on what the word is, obviously. So when we say vessels, we don't mean it in the literal sense. We mean it in the sort of in this figurative sense. The limitation that there is, or let's call it not limitation, but the definition of certain concepts, ideas, feelings, awarenesses, experiences, that definition of them, or that broader, if you want to not use the word definition, but use the term, that description of something is what's called the vessel, the kli. But within that vessel is what is called the light. Within the vessel is the light. And that light is the divine energy, which, because it has something to be manifested in, it can be experienced. And that's why Kabbalah so often uses the metaphor of light, because light too acts in the same way. If light goes through a medium, like the medium of outer space, for example, when you look at outer space, even though it's really filled with light, since there's nothing blocking the light, there's nothing defining the light, therefore it just looks completely black. Yes, you can see stars in the background and so on and so forth, but those stars are giving forth light, and the whole physical universe is it's filled with light. There's light crisscrossing from all kinds of suns and this and that and the other, all over the place. Why is it that we don't see it? Because there's nothing to reflect the light. There's nothing to hold it back. There's nothing to. But if you go out into outer space, or if you look at pictures, for example, of astronauts in outer space, you'll see that they're very, very brightly lit, not by any light on their aircraft, on their spacecraft, but lit by the light of that's there in the vacuum of space. So why is this important? It's important to talk about the vessel and the light in the vessel. Why? Because in order to manifest that light and manifest it more clearly, in other words, in order not to block the light, we have to, so that the light can shine through the vessel, we have to know how these things operate together in harmony, and what we need to do to make the light manifested through ourselves, through our very selves. Now, in the vessel itself, there are two aspects of the vessels. The outer aspect, just like if you would look at a cup, you see the outside of the cup, and then there's the inside of the cup. The inside of the cup is what contains all the good stuff in the cup, the liquid, whatever it may happen to be, tea, coffee, water, wine, whatever, right? It's the inside of the cup that contains, but theoretically speaking, it's the outside of the cup that transmits to the recipient, to another recipient. In other words, you pour outside of the cup, it's the outer surface, I suppose you could say, which transfers what's inside the cup to the outside, but it's the inside surface of the cup which contains and receives the liquid within it. So with the sphirot, there's an inner dimension of the sphirot and there's an outer dimension of the sphirot. Besides the light in the sphira, of the kli itself, of the vessel of the sphira, there are two dimensions: the inner, the container dimension, and the transmitter dimension, or the outer form and the inner receptivity. That's the proper way to think about it: the outer form and the inner receptivity. So we will find in all kinds of meditations that there's various levels that are spoken about. There's, first of all, we have to clarify, we have to get clear for ourselves what the outer form is. And then what is the thing that's doing the receiving? How is it receiving? And what is it receiving? It's receiving the light in that particular level. So this is really what the worlds and the souls are all about, or the worlds and the levels of consciousness. We said that there's four primary worlds. The fifth The world is a meta world. We just talk about the primary worlds now, the immanent worlds. The immanent worlds have an outer aspect and an inner aspect. The outer aspect of the world is the structure of that particular world, and the inner dimension of that world is the consciousness that's associated with that particular level of world, that particular whichever that world may happen to be. And then, as an altogether separate issue, there's the concept of the light of of that world. This is actually called, if you want to know, it is actually in the Baal Shem Tov's terminology. In the Baal Shem Tov's terminology, the Baal Shem Tov was the founder of Hasidism and a miracle worker and a very profound thinker. Although he didn't write down any treatises or any major works. That was left to his disciples to do. The Arizal also wrote very little. The Arizal wrote basically one work himself, and everything else was written by his students. He just taught, and they wrote. And the truth is the same thing with the Zohar. The Zohar is also not written by Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. It was written primarily by his student Rabbi Abba and other students as well, but primarily his student Rabbi Abba was the one that wrote the Zohar. And this is actually stated in the Zohar itself. In any event, some of the greatest teachers did not write down their teachings. Why? Because the teachings couldn't be contained, they couldn't contain their teachings in words. Okay, so um, to get back to what I was talking about before I digressed, um, the Baal Shem Tov talks about three concepts called Olamot, Neshamot, Elokut. Olamot is the worlds, Neshamot is the levels of consciousness, and then there's godliness. These parallel what we just spoke about as the outer aspect of the vessel, the structural aspect of the vessel, the outer surface, the inner receptivity thereto, which is now the consciousness or the soul aspect. And then there's the light contained within it, that's called the divinity or the godliness. Now, what's meditation supposed to do? Meditation is supposed to um, use the outer structure, which can be sensed in one way or another, as a means to focus consciousness and then turn that consciousness towards the light, so to speak, towards the light that's contained within that vessel. So in this, we start off like looking outwards in a sense, looking outwards. And then um, once we've been looking outwards, that then is turned inward. That's turned inward and towards the light that fills the vessel, towards the third dimension. Again, olamot neshamot elokut, worlds, consciousness, and godliness. The ultimate thing is to turn towards and to experience, and not only just to experience, but to lose oneself within that godliness. But when I say lose oneself, that's only as a temporary thing, because just in this week's Torah reading, we read about the two sons of Aaron who were, it said that they brought a strange fire or an alien fire before God. And that alien fire, it's explained in Kabbalistic works, in the Zohar and in Arizal and in Hasidic works, that what they did was they disdained this physical world, and all they wanted to do was to cleave above. And that's what they did. There's a famous Kabbalist named the Or HaChaim. He wrote a commentary on the Chumash, the five books of Moses. He wrote a commentary on the five books of Moses, the Or HaChaim, and he describes this very, very clearly if anyone wants to go and look. I think the Or HaChaim has been translated into English as well, Or HaChaim. In any event, the idea was, what they did was they decided that they wanted to cleave to God and forget about this world. They weren't interested in the world anymore. And in fact, God says, "Bikrovai Akadesh, I will be sanctified through those who are close to me." In other words, they died. their souls left their bodies, they got what they wanted, and it was a tragedy because they had a tremendous amount of potential to bring that light down into the world. So the idea is not to get lost in the light and never come back. That is an ideal in some other paths, some other religions, but it's not a path in Judaism, and it's certainly not a path in Kabbalah either, although you may find more mystical and less mystical paths, but all of them understand that we're here for a purpose, and that purpose is to make the world a more godly place. If anyone wants more information on this or to look into it more in more depth, there's a very good text on it called the Tanya, chapter 26. Tanya, chapter 26. I'm sorry, chapter 36, not 26. Chapter 36 in Tanya discusses this whole issue and explains what the purpose of creation is. But we're talking about meditation now, and meditation is to turn towards the light, essentially. So we say that there's four worlds. Each world is characterized by its own um, structure, inner structure and outer structure. In other words, outer structure, the form of the world, inner structure, the consciousness that is associated with that world, or level of soul, if you want to call it, instead of consciousness. Okay, let's just talk about what what that world, what the worlds are. Let's actually talk about them in detail, or at least in some detail, not in a lot of detail, but some. The world of Asiya, the lowest of the lowest world. The physical world is the lowest aspect of the lowest world. Although the world of Asiya is in fact a spiritual world, but the lowest counterpart thereof, Malchut, the Malchut of Asiya, is this physical world. The Malchut of Asiya is the physical world. So, what is the physical world? We don't need a description from me to explain what the physical world is. We all experience it ourselves on a daily basis. It's basically the world of space and time, and primarily time. Time is the biggest feature of this world. Space is a feature of the world of Yetzirah. We'll get to it soon. But the concept of the world of Asiya and the level of soul, the level of consciousness, which is called Nefesh, is the interface is how we experience the world around us. And we experience the world through what is called our chushim, our senses. According to Kabbalah, there's actually 12 senses, not 5. One of the senses, interestingly enough, is the sense of sleep. Sefer Yetzirah talks about it, the sense of sleep. There's a number of different senses. I'm not going to go into all of them now. Let's just talk about our physical senses, the ones that we know and understand. If in the future anyone is interested, yes, Ellen, that is true. They do relate to the level of Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod. Yes, in the Torah, the level of Pshat is the Asiyah of Torah. The level of Remez is Yetzirah. The level of Drash is Bria of the Torah. And Atzilut is Sod, the secret teachings of the Torah. Very nice point, and that is in fact 100% correct. Okay, so our senses are what interface with the world. Now we know that there are people, for example, the famous Helen Keller, who is blind and deaf, but nevertheless managed to have a tremendous impact on the world. How she did it, tremendous, must have been a tremendous soul. But nevertheless, for the vast majority of us, we are impacted all the time, bombarded with sensory perceptions of the world around us. Now, some of those sensory perceptions are colored by things that are not actually sensory perceptions, but rather emotions. One of the first things in the first stage of meditation is to get rid of all the interpretations of those sensations and just experience the pure sensation. Right now, very often you have to close your eyes to do it. So you're not experiencing the sensation of sight necessarily with your eyes open. although keeping your eyes open and focusing on a certain point also helps for this. But a lot of people just simply prefer to close their eyes and imagine things. So getting down to the very first stage. Now, again, I should have mentioned this in the beginning. There's many, many, many forms of meditation. I'm just going to give you one over here, one that's easy, doesn't involve a lot of complicated ideas. You may disagree with me, but believe me, they can get very complicated when you start. Um, um, when you start um, getting involved in the Arizal's meditations, and some of the students of the Arizal's can get extremely complicated. Abraham Abulafia and so on, it just you have to have tremendous memory for them and so on and so forth. So this is, relatively speaking, very simple. Helen, that needs some thinking about. Another question she asked, and I don't have the answer right now. Okay, so the first thing, therefore, is to still the senses, not to cut them off, not to batter them into submission, but simply to let the pure senses operate without any interpretation. This is an exercise which has come to be called mindfulness in some circles. Um, it's interesting that it's called mindfulness because it really is, to a certain extent, the opposite. It's emptying the mind. It's not mind fillingness, it's mind emptiness. But nevertheless, that is um, that is the reality. That's what it's all about. It's sort of emptying the mind, not emptying the mind in the sense of not interpreting the sensations which are arriving from moment to moment through your senses. Now, for some people, they find it very difficult to, what's the expression in the American expression, to chew gum and ride a bicycle at the same time. I think that's what it is. Yeah, something like that. They find it very difficult to do two things at the same time. Uh, Men find it more difficult than women. Interestingly enough, women are multitaskers by their very nature. Women are much more adept at multitasking than men, so um, they can probably do these experiments quite easily. Um, in other words, using all the senses at the same time. But it doesn't matter. You don't have to use all the senses at the same time. You can do one or two or three or whatever, or even one at a time and then go to another one and then to another one. In other words, you can, from point of view of hearing, of feeling, touch, scent, and sight. Now, if it so turns out that there's one sense rather that you particularly attached to, and you feel that that's your scent. For some people, for example, the sense of taste is one of the most powerful senses that they have. For instance, people who are wine tasters, how they can taste those things in wines, I really don't know. I don't smoke or anything like that, but I just don't have that developed sense of taste that some people do. It's an amazing thing. And similar things similarly with scent, with smell. Some people are very adept at smelling the various components of, let's say, a perfume or whatever. It's amazing, whatever. It doesn't matter. Then there's hearing and there's seeing and so on. But if you focus just on one sense or one sense at a time, and just let that sense, and this doesn't have to take a very long time at all. It can take as long as you want, but in fact, some people remain in this meditation for a long time before moving on. But just getting the senses to quieten down and not be involved in interpretation. The mind should not be interfering with the senses, interpreting what it is that you're smelling, what it is that you're tasting, what it is that you're hearing, seeing, etc. Okay. Once those senses become sort of purified out a little bit, And again, there's stages in this. There's the beginning stage, and there's more advanced stages, and so on. But you'll have to go where it's good for you. Then there is a transition to a higher level of meditation. What's that transition? Well, this is what is called in Kabbalistic literature, in the Zohar, it's called the Amud, the pillar, between the lower Garden of Eden and the higher Garden of Eden. Now, when it says lower and higher, you expect that there's only two Gardens of Eden. In fact, that each world has a Garden of Eden. And in each world, in fact, there's a lower and a higher Garden of Eden. Let's not get into that now, but be aware that when we say higher and lower Garden of Eden, we're only talking about in one world, and each of the worlds has a lower and higher Garden of Eden. So, to transcend from the lower state of calmness to a higher level, to a higher state of calmness, that's through what is called the Amud. The first Amud, the first pillar, the first, let's call it escalator or elevator. Elevator is good word. That's the right word. The first Aliyah from the world of Asiya to the world of Yetzirah comes about through our own internal clock. Let me explain what I mean. One of the main features, as I mentioned before, in fact, the main feature of the world of Asiya is it is a world that is subject to time. The higher the world, the less subject it is to time. The world of Atzilut is not subject to time at all. The world of Bria is much less, it's much more subject to time than the world of Atzilut, but it's not time in the way that we can understand it. There's only, um, in a sense, two dimensions of time in the world of Bria. I'll get there later. We'll talk about that. But in the world of Asiya is where time really happens. Now, how does time happen? Time is measured in the external sense. Time is measured by the rotation of the way it's measured today, the rotation of the Earth, right? Or the way it looks like is it's the way the sun goes around the Earth. That's the way it looks. And the truth is that the mathematics of both of them would work equally well. One's a little bit more complicated than the other, but nevertheless, you could say that the sun circles around the Earth if you want to make a geocentric model, or the Earth circles around the sun in a heliocentric model. There's various reasons that the sages preferred a geocentric model because it fits better with the structure of Kabbalistic things. But it doesn't mean to say that this was an absolute. I understood that you could do the mathematics from either point of view. Just that since we're here, we like to do the mathematics from here. So, therefore, sunrise and sunset basically define our elements of time. There's daylight hours, nighttime hours, and we come again to sunrise again the following day, or to midnight in the way we work the calendar today. Midnight changes over to the new day, and so on and so forth. I don't have to go into these things; everybody knows them. But just like you have that in the physical, in the outer world, so do you have in the world of consciousness. In the world of consciousness, what's that called? The internal clock. The internal clock is your pulse. The internal clock is your pulse. And in a much easier format, it's your breath, right? Your breath going in and out, that gap between one in breath and the next in breath defines a certain unit of time. Now, in Hebrew, this is called ratzo v'shov, right? Running and returning. It's from the first chapter of Ezekiel. In the first chapter of Ezekiel, Ezekiel describes the divine chariot, in other words, the vehicle for godliness, that which um, um, began to manifest godliness in creation. And that was called Vahachayot Ratzo Vashov, the literal translation. The animals pulling the chariot, the wild beasts pulling the chariot, the divine chariot. Of course, this is all only a metaphor. It's not meant to be taken literally. the divine beasts pulling the chariot were in a state of ratzovashol. They were jumping up and coming down, jumping up, like, for example, when horses are pulling a carriage, right? So they're sort of not jumping up and down, but when they gallop, they have this natural rhythm. Interestingly enough, I just read something, a story, very interesting story, about the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, not Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, but Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe. Our Rebbe was the seventh Rebbe, and he was this is a story about the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe. This was in the time in the early 1900s, in Russia or in Eastern Europe is where he was, and he was at some kind of he was staying in a hotel, was traveling somewhere, and in that same hotel was the Rebbe, the Hasidic master of a different branch of Hasidism. Someone who was named the Alexander Rebbe, and they were talking and so on and so forth. And the previous Rebbe happened to mention the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe happened to mention that one of the cures for depression, the cure for depression, is to ride in a horse-drawn carriage. To ride in a horse-drawn carriage. And one of the reasons is because it regulates a person's pulse beat, it regulates his heartbeat, regulates the general, how do you call it, rhythms. It regulates the rhythms of a person's physical being and calms a person, brings down a person into a much calmer state. Why? Because when the horse is moving as it does when it's galloping and pulling the carriage, it's a very gentle sort of a swaying movement that is normally quite close to the span of the breath. Now, if you listen to some people when they even when they're sitting in a car, but for sure when they're walking, their breath is very short. That kind of thing. Terrible, right? Very filled with stress. Short breath. One of the expressions for a person who's always angry, they call him short of breath. Right? He's short of breath, meaning he doesn't take time he doesn't calm himself down with his breath. So the breath is an idea of calming. It's an idea of calming a person, and it doesn't only calm a person, but it allows one to transcend to this higher state of consciousness. So after feeling through the senses and experiencing the senses, the transition to the next world up, the next stage is through the breath. Now you may think that the most important aspect is when the breath goes in, and then goes out. That going out of the breath is not as important as the coming in. That's what you might think, but it's in fact the opposite is true. Bringing the breath into oneself is filling yourself with energy, and then breathing out is letting that energy dissipate right throughout the body and then beyond yourself, right? Beyond the limitations of the body. And therefore you'll find that when a person is in a very meditative state, he's not holding his breath. He's without breath. He's not breathing. And if it's forced, it's obviously not the right thing. It has to come naturally. There are some very good breathing exercises that one can do. I'm just trying to remember the name. There's a certain person, I think he's actually Dutch originally. What is his name now? and remember, but I will remember sooner or later. Um, but he teaches very good sort of breath management. Anyway, whatever it is, let me just explain it briefly. Deep breath in and an even deeper breath out. In other words, the breath out should not be as sharp as the breath going in. The breath going in doesn't have to be sharp at all, but the breath going out should be long, not holding your breath in and straining it out. No, just breathing in. Wim Hof, there you are. Thank you. Wim Hof. You just look him up on the internet, you'll find him on YouTube. Um, some of the other things that he's involved in, I'm not talking about just his breathing exercises. They're very, very simple, very straightforward, and very beneficial. So he holds by a system of 30 breaths and 30 breaths at 30, whatever, but 30 breaths, breathing in deeply and then breathing out deeply and calmly and long, and not rushing to breathe out, not rushing to breathe in, whatever. But as you go into it, you'll calm down more and more and more. And then at the end of those 30 breaths, you leave your breath out. You end off on an out breath, which you hold for a certain amount of time, as long as you can hold it without being uncomfortable. And then you take a deep in breath and hold that. And then again, just breathe gently. Okay. So, very useful exercises, but you will find that actually sends you into, because it oxygenates your brain as well, you'll find that it sends you into you can now hold his breath for 59 minutes. Wow. That's pretty good. uh, 59 minutes. Wow, that's amazing. Anyway, the idea is that once you sort of master this, that using the breath is part of a meditation. The breath itself is not the goal. It's just part of a meditation to lift oneself up to a higher level of consciousness. The next level of consciousness up, the next world, it's called the world of Yetzirah. But we will get to that next week, and the techniques we use in the world of Yetzirah, meditative techniques. All right, you can work on it for this week, and next week. Yeah, I said to you next week I'm actually not going to be able to teach a class because I'll be visiting with my mother. Actually, I'll probably be on my way back then, but it'll be late at night already, so I'm not going to be able to give a class. So the following week we'll talk about the meditation to do with the basics of meditation to do with the world of Yetzirah, and the following week we'll do Priya, and maybe we'll get to Atzilus. We'll see. To Atzilut. Any questions, ladies and gentlemen, please? Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Let me just see if Ernest came in. I'd like to thank him personally. I didn't. All right, folks, any other questions? Reference for types of consciousness. Reference for types of consciousness. I think you can look at, if I remember correctly, it's from a work called Sha'arei Oira, which is from Rabbi Chaim Vital in the Hebrew. Sha'arei Oira. Oh, I'm sorry, not Sha'arei Oira, Sha'arei Kedusha. I'm sorry, Sha'arei Kedusha. Sha'arei Oira is a completely different book. Sha'arei Kedusha from Rabbi Chaim Vital. But if I remember correctly, it's part of it is translated in Rabbi Kaplan, Aryeh Kaplan's Meditation and the Kabbalah. Meditation and the Kabbalah. Yes, Terry, that is actually a very good point. Today was Holocaust Remembrance Day. All the memories for our families. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, thank you for reminding us, Terry. It's a very yeah, my father-in-law was actually in Auschwitz amongst several other camps. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Mauthausen. He survived all of them. And he was a very, very humble, very pleasant, really nice person. Um, my wife's father. So, all right, folks. There don't seem to be many questions. We'll leave it at that. Thanks. Thanks for the good wishes, everybody, and see you in a couple of weeks. Shabbat shalom from Colombia. Shabbat shalom to you. Very nice. Okay, folks, we'll call it a day. Good night.